So what I want to talk about first is what the CUGC user share is about. We want to introduce it to the community. This is our first CUGC user share, and it's our first webinar. And one of the things when we started putting together CUGC and we spoke with members or future members at Synergy and online, is people really wanted user content. They wanted to hear users talking about their experiences. So that's what this is about. As you'll see, we have users on the call. We have users calling in, and we're going to take questions throughout. And that's what it's aimed at, is just user-to-user experiences. We're going to focus on user experience in real-world application. The format, very simply, it's the way members work. Most people don't have a lot of time, but they have about an hour. They can check in on a webinar. They want this recorded. We are going to record it. They want it available online. And as you can see, we're doing it from all different places. People are calling in from all around the world, and each of the panelists today will be in a different location. One of the things I want to note is that after this is over, this discussion will continue on mycugc.org. We'll open a thread, so if there's anything that is discussed on the call that you want to have more questions on, you want to connect more on, just go to the website and go to the discussion forums, and you can keep it going there. I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to work the CUGC user share, who can do them, and really what it comes down to is we want more people to do what Bill and Andy, we're going to have someone else join us. Bob Barr is going to join us in a bit, another user. We want people, you can do this as a local group. Today, the first group up, it's the Charlotte CUGC. So they had an idea. They thought this user experience would be interesting. They presented it to us, and so we made it available to the entire community. So if you have something you think would be interesting to the community, you want to share, let us know. You can do it through your local group. You can do it through a special interest group, or you can do it as an individual user. We'll help you work it out. To make that happen, you can just email us at hq@mycugc.org. And that's it. I just want to say thanks again for everybody for connecting and being part of it. I see Bob now is on with us. I'm now going to turn it over to Andy. He's going to take it from here, and we're going to get into the webinar. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, George. I really appreciate you guys being really supportive of this. And, you know, the idea, like you said, is to share information. We're going to have plenty of opportunities to hear from Citrix and from other industry experts and tell us what they think. But to be quite honest, what this group has always, or groups like this have always been about, is trying to find ways to share information with each other. You know, personally, I go around and I see a lot of Citrix environments, and I see a lot of people asking the same questions and struggling with the same issues, and that's some of what we want to tackle here by bringing somebody on who's, you know, got a story to share, but then allowing people to kind of chime in. You know, we have Bob Baer. Bob is one of the co-leaders here of the Charlotte Citrix user group community, and Bob is the Citrix administrator at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. University of North Carolina is a large university school system, and Charlotte's a very large campus as well. Bob, how you doing?
Doing good, Andy. Yeah, very big campus. Those of you who aren't familiar, UNC Charlotte, we're looking at 28,000 students, and we continue to grow. Building is constantly going on here, so we're hoping to continue to move Citrix in a positive direction. Start using this, even just this semester, starting to use it more and more for students. So everything that we learn on these kind of webinars and the get-togethers that we're going to have in the future are all going to be positive things for myself and everyone else involved.
Yeah, I mean, Bob's been kind of taking part in some of these conversations for the past 2 years, I guess, where we've been getting groups of people together here locally, and you know, not to put words in his mouth, but I think it's been very helpful for him. And you know, now every time I talk to him, he's more educated on what we're talking about, and we spend less time trying to get the terminology all straight and more time talking about what we're going to do next. And you know, that's pretty common, right? There's a lot of terminology, a lot of things to go over, and if we have to, you know, start from square one every time, that makes it difficult. So, Bob, thanks, and feel free to chime in, and let's ask Bill some questions here at some point, and let's try to get him to share as much as we can and get what we can out of him, because I know he's got a lot to say. So that leads us over to Bill Bailey, who chuckled when I said he has a lot to say. Bill can talk Citrix for hours if you want. I know we're going to limit this to 1 hour, and like George said, we're going to ask questions. Please use the questions options within the webinar, the GoToWebinar, to ask questions. But we're going to try to stay on, myself and maybe some of the others will stay on after an hour if there's questions we didn't get to but definitely let's try to get some questions in there. That's what this is kind of all about, is making sure we got your questions answered. All right, so Bill, Dr. Bill Bailey, you're with High Point Regional Hospital System, which is now part of the University of North Carolina Health Care System. So it's kind of interesting, right? We got Bob, who's on the education side for the University of North Carolina, and then Bill, who's on the health side with High Point Regional, which was, I guess, acquired by the UNC Health Care System about a year or two ago. So Bill, welcome. How are you?
Oh, doing fine. Glad to be here. Yeah, you're right. We were acquired about 2 years ago. So before that, we were a separate nonprofit system ourselves. And since the acquisition, we've been integrated into the UNC Health Care system.
Yeah, so this is great, right? We have education on one side, we have healthcare on the other, so that's two really big verticals. We ought to be able to answer a lot of questions for people. And let's be honest, I mean, Citrix is really just Windows applications. It's middleware. It's taking end users and connecting them to Windows applications, and that covers healthcare. That covers education. It also covers legal and financial and manufacturing. I mean, it's Windows apps, and how do we get them in the hands of end users? So, good sampling here, but more to talk about, I'm sure. And like George said, let's encourage other people to want to be part of this and tell their story and help other people get further down the road quicker with Citrix. So Bill, before we start into the technical part, anything special you want to tell us about Bill that's people might find interesting, that's not necessarily what Citrix is all about for you?
Well, I'm a geek from way back. I've been involved in technology in one form or another, and particularly enterprise computer technology, for over 30 years at this point. Back in the day, I worked with digital equipment, computer VAX systems. Everything was terminals, and so that was where I started. A little bit IBM mainframe, but not much. Mostly what we called mid-range computers back then, and since then have gotten involved in, of course, Windows computing, basically since it began with version 1. So I'm dating myself quite a bit there. But then as we progressed to networking it with Windows for Workgroups 3.11, that was kind of the pinnacle of that era for me. And then, of course, Windows NT came out. We were involved in the original beta for Windows NT, as a matter of fact, at CUGC, which is where I was at the time. And it's been a real experience all the way through. And when I first got involved with Citrix, give you a little background there, I was working as Enterprise System Manager at the Center for Creative Leadership. And it was about 1998, 1999. Center for Creative Leadership is an educational institution for Fortune 500 organizations. And we had a particular system that was written in-house, and it was designed to help the presenters of the educational information, when they held their seminars and so forth. But the problem was all the data that was in that resided in our headquarters in Greensboro. We had Brussels, Belgium. We had Singapore. We had San Diego, California, and then Colorado Springs, Colorado. So all of those different sites were in different time zones. We were talking about how do we replicate the data from this database-driven application and all these different locations, and how we were going to keep that in sync across all time zones. And it was getting very complicated. Well, at the time, I was doing a lot of research and development, and I'd gotten a hold of Citrix. And I'd set up a little skunkworks project, as I like to call it, just kind of get it running. And
so give me a time frame. What was that? That was about when?
That was roughly 99.
1999. So you're talking Windows NT Terminal Server Edition at that point, or are we talking about? Okay.
Yep. And it was, I believe, it was version 3 of Citrix. This was prior to XP, because XP, I was trained on XP September 11th, 2001, so that sticks in my mind, that date.
Yeah, not bad,
but I was actually in training when that occurred. So we had migrated, well, first of all, let me back up. We went into to Citrix because we had to get this application to all these locations. And so I suggested, hey, look, this was on a Thursday. I said, let's try setting this up and see if we can get it to work for all these different locations. And so sure enough, we got it together, got it working on my little project I had there. And so everybody was so excited about it. They said, look, we got training that starts Monday. Can you get this in production by Monday? Well, this was Thursday. I had the weekend, and then Monday was supposed to be training in front of CEOs and Fortune 500 types. So it had to be really bulletproof. And it was a bit nerve-wracking, but we got it all working across all locations. And, of course, since it was all right out of Greensboro, there was no database merging. There was no special time zone considerations other than being aware of what time zone you're in with regard to the data. And it worked out very well. And so that was the beginning of our really exciting start with Citrix. And we just kept upgrading and moving and rolling on from there. And then after I left CCL, I went to work at High Point Regional. Been there now for a little over 8 years at this point. And
so let's touch base on what you just said just now. So one quick housekeeping thing. Hey guys, if you're online and you're listening and you want to make comments, make comments in the chat window for everyone and not in the questions area, because it could get kind of confusing as just random dialogue shows up in the questions area. So definitely take advantage of the chat section of the app. So Bill, one of the things I want to do, I want to qualify what you just said, right? So everybody, when I had that conversation around when you started with Citrix, they usually use the product names to, in fact, somebody even did in the questions area. So that was Terminal NT4 Terminal Server Edition, right? When Terminal Services wasn't baked into Windows Server Editions, and it must have been
pre-WinFrame.
So it was.
I mean, it was after WinFrame. I'm sorry, WinFrame had already come out. I did not get involved with it at that level. But right after that, with NT.
So so WinFrame was its own thing, and then MetaFrame came out that ran on top of the NT. The terminal server product from Windows, right?
Right.
And then prior to that was WinFrame, and there's a whole conversation if you ever want to go out and then look online and hear about Citrix and Microsoft and how they figured out how they were going to work together, because it was really kind of touch and go there for a very long time. So that's a great conversation, right? It's how a lot of people end up as doing Citrix, right? They had a unbelievably difficult use case, and that delivery technology, that presentation layer technology was, to some degree, certainly in a short time frame and for a low amount of money, the only answer, right?
Right. And it became our standard very quickly. All applications were delivered through Citrix after this incident, and I actually had to deal with our because this was all built in-house. This was all Visual Basic programming, and one of the things that I had to educate them on at the time, they weren't used to thinking in terms of multi-user. And so they were writing the application so that all the data was being written to one specific part of the database, and even part of it written to a file structure. And it was overwriting it because of multiple users using it on the Citrix servers. So I had to kind of educate them on the idea that you have to do it by user, and each user needs a location to write their data. And once we got them convinced of the need to do that, it really helped straighten out the system. And of course, we're talking years ago. People were not used to thinking of Windows in terms of a multi-user, environment. And now we've come way far down the road from that point. But it was interesting days back then, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I want everybody to know we're going to get into some more of the technology. I think this webcast is going to be a little difficult. We've got to talk through some of the scenario, and then we're going to dig into more technical conversations here in a few minutes. So just hold on, it's certainly coming. And it sounds like I'm in trouble because I told everybody to use the chat window, and I see a chat window, and everybody else doesn't see it. So lots of people are letting me know that for sure. But okay, so you found your way into Citrix because you were a geek, right, like a lot of us, and you needed a solution that would work over a wide area network. Any dial-up connections in that scenario, or was it just all private network?
Back then there was a lot of dial-up, particularly with reps around the country. And that was one of the big, I was a big proponent of the ICA protocol, being such a tiny protocol that allowed the screen paints to occur without having to push huge amounts of data over the wire. And, particularly when we started working with Singapore, and we're talking all the way around the world, halfway around the world, the fact that we didn't have to push tons of data but could rather do screen paints through Citrix was a lifesaver for us for working with their data. So a big benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so a million things we could talk about in that one, and maybe we'll come back to it or not. But so after that, you found yourself working for a mid-size, would you say, hospital system that had no Citrix, or you introduced Citrix, or how did that all unfold?
No, they were looking for a Citrix engineer at the time, having a hard time finding anybody. And I was contacted by a headhunter group, and they said, hey, you got to look at this. And at the time I was working at CCL, I wasn't interested in going anywhere. But the guy kept saying, hey, come on, check it out. And I talked to them and I was intrigued at the idea of it's a roughly 400-bed hospital, probably a little under that. They already had a Citrix environment, very complex at the time. I like to joke that when I got there, it was held together with chewing gum and baling wire, but that's about right.
Right.
I had to come in. When I did come in, I basically had to rebuild the entire farm at the time to get everything straightened out. But they had a guy who really was very sharp. He had handed off to another guy who wasn't really that interested in being a Citrix administrator. So they were looking for a guy that really knew the environment well. This organization put me together with them. We did some interviews, phone interviews, and then physical interviews. Once they hired me, I came in, and it was an overload. It was like the expression, trying to drink from a fire hose. There was just so much information to be had with healthcare, HIPAA regulations, and 24/7, 365 hospital. Lots of issues that never came up at CCL. CCL, great place to work, great folks, do a lot of good things, but it's not a life or death situation if your computer doesn't display the right screen or have the right information. In a hospital environment, it does. So as they like to remind us occasionally, there's somebody laying there on the operating table relying on your computer screen and the data they see. So really had to work on getting that farm cleaned up, made more reliable, because it had a bad reputation. A lot of people said, oh, it's Citrix. That was the general, anytime anything occurred, Citrix is down, was the response. And one of my challenges was to try to make it bulletproof and solid and get us to a point where Citrix wasn't blamed for everything, which, believe it or not, after 8 years, I've finally gotten there. The network gets blamed first, or storage, but not Citrix.
That's great. I know
you have to pass along how you made that happen, because that's a tough road to hoe right there, yes.
It really is.
Just the idea that we can get people on that say that in front of hundreds of people, I mean, that goes a long way, and that happens everywhere we go, right? If Citrix is getting the blame for a lot of stuff that it probably doesn't have a whole lot to do with, other than the fact that it's a consumer of those items as well.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a network-based application, and you're only as good as your network. So, and that's another story we can get into when we start talking VDI. VDI particularly is extremely sensitive to a solid network. So one of the first things we did when we got into VDI was revamp how our network was put together, and have a consulting group come in and test everything about our network to clean it up.
So Bill, let's talk about that real quick, because that's a great segue, but probably faster than I wanted to go there.
All right.
At High Point Regional, you guys were doing application virtualization, hosted application virtualization, what I call a server-hosted shared app, what most Citrix people are going to call a published app. In the Microsoft world, we call it a remote app. But you guys were making applications available virtually to end users. Give me an idea of the scale of that. Was that like 10% of the applications and primarily the EMR application that came from their Citrix, or did 90% of all applications in the hospital get delivered through Citrix?
It was closer to 90. We had about, at the high point, we had about 68 business applications of all kinds, clinical, business, delivery of record keeping of purchases, I mean, anything and everything, but all of it in Citrix. So there was actually very little installed locally on the PC. The PC had Microsoft Office. We used GroupWise email back then, so the email, and that was really about it. Everything else came through Citrix.
So you didn't even have Office installed as part of the main installation on your Citrix at that time? You did, but it was
didn't in Citrix. We had it in the build of the PC.
Locally. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Now,
So, but you didn't offer it up in Citrix then at that time, or it was there too, or how did you do that?
Eventually I put it there. As a matter of fact, I put, well, okay, let me back up a step. High Point Regional didn't have, because we're a nonprofit hospital at the time, we didn't have the resources and the contract with Microsoft to allow us to have Office for every single desktop. So only the business users, business and finance group, had that. However, I got the brilliant idea one day, hey, what about LibreOffice, you know? So I installed LibreOffice in Citrix and made it available, particularly for nurses that were out there. They had viewers that they used. They had a Word viewer, they had an Excel viewer, but by giving them LibreOffice and tweaking the defaults so that it wrote in Word format and wrote in Excel format through Citrix, then they had the ability to use Office applications, even though we couldn't afford Office licenses. Now, fortunately, with UNC Health Care and the Microsoft license we have with them, the enterprise license, that's no longer an issue. So we are no longer doing that, and now we're using Office everywhere. But it was a neat little workaround at the time. I'm nothing if not a tweaker.
Well, and that's a great story for Citrix, right? You have some need that's completely out of character with what you would normally do in an IT environment, and you're able to use Citrix to make the command prompt or some off-brand of a Microsoft Office derivative available to massive amounts of end users that are probably running around with mobile carts on wheels type setups, right?
Exactly. Yeah, what we call the COWs, computers on wheels, are all over the hospital, and they have USB scanners to scan medicines and things like that and keep up with patients. All of that runs through Citrix as well. The devices through the COWs going through Citrix works very well with USB attached devices.
Hey, so one quick housekeeping thing again. So guys, we're going to get into an opportunity to ask some really technical questions. I'm just trying to give Bill an opportunity to get through his story, because that's really what a lot of people are online for. But if you're out there and you have some technical questions, don't leave just because we haven't got real techie yet, because we certainly will, or we'll try to at least. So just trying to get through Bill's story, try to share that story with other people, and then from that we'll build upon letting people ask questions about Bill's Citrix experience, as well as get as technical or as deep as we possibly can. So just hang on, we'll get to that. There's some. The minute we started, there were technical questions rolling in, and you hadn't had a chance to even say anything about who you were or where you worked or what you did.
Right.
Okay, so Bill's story, right? So using a little bit of Citrix in a very tight use case scenario, moved on to a healthcare mid-sized hospital that needed to do application virtualization, and hosted application virtualization through Citrix was the answer at that point. And then I'm sure somewhere along the way, Bill, the conversation said, hey, this is great for Windows apps. What about desktops, right? And that was probably about the time somebody out there started calling that VDI, which I always struggle with, as you know, the concept of the term VDI. But virtual desktops, right? And specifically in your case, VDI became a story at the hospital because people wanted to extend the success of Citrix into virtual desktops. So I don't know, tell us what happened there.
All right. Basically, our need fell along the lines of control.
Hey, Bill, I got to stop you real quick, because somebody did ask a really, really good question just now.
Okay.
Back in the day when it was not a handful, but a lot of strategic applications virtualized, Citrix got the blame a lot of times, and you knew it was the network level. But you made a comment a minute ago that the hospital didn't really get serious about checking into how much of this was related to the network until virtual desktops came up, and you started using that great big Windows app, which is the desktop, right? So did I understand you to say that right?
Yes,
you had challenges
correct.
when it was applications that were kind of brushed aside, but when the decision was made to go desktops, all of a sudden everybody said we got to take a hard look before we move forward.
Right, and it was a mindset issue. They had already decided that it was always Citrix that was the problem. And no matter how much I tried to say, look, I can show you with EdgeSight, I can show you exactly what's happening, they were saying, oh, don't worry, it's just Citrix. And so I never made that case until we got to the point that VDI was an issue, and we had taken it, IT had taken it on the chin quite a bit for years because of the lack of performance, because of the issues we were seeing, and because people were blaming Citrix. And so the idea of rolling out a VDI environment was a little daunting to us because we knew it could go very, very badly. And if it did, that we would lose what little reputation we had gained or regained. So we basically decided we're going to make sure this thing works soup to nuts. We're going to try to think through everything we can. And I will say this, we brought in some outside help. We brought in some people to look at the network. We tried to think through everything we can. Now, it just so happens that we got a lot of benefit out of that. The need to help get everything set up for the foundation of VDI helped Citrix, helped other applications, because we ended up having to redo the network, redo the way the network topology was set up, because it was just kind of thrown together. And it was more logically and consistently put together by the time we started doing VDI.
Yeah, there's another customer not too far from you guys that had a failed Citrix project that was just written off as, you know, the Citrix product just not being good, and then they had another project, I don't know, a year or so later that that they revamped the network for and found they had all kinds of issues, and all of a sudden it was like, hey, you know, that Citrix stuff probably worked after all, and we just swept it under the rug because of network-related stuff. And I know Bob can relate to some of that as well. I think we all face that, right? Without the network performance, this presentation layer stuff that we're hosting and delivering from the data center it just can't. I mean, actually, they do a really good job with session reliability and things like that, overcoming network challenges, and that's one technical nugget for the people on the phone, right? If you got session reliability turned on, there's chances you've got network issues and you don't know it because Citrix has been built to overcome those types of things. Can you, Bill, in your specific example, was there one technical piece of the network? Was it just the topology and how it had been kind of built upon for all those years, or was there something specific that was the culprit for all that time?
It wasn't any one thing. I mean, we literally had situations where there were routing loops occurring. There were, different VLANs that weren't talking to other VLANs. I mean, there was all kinds of crazy issues, and I'm not really that much of a network person, so I give all the credit to the network guys that we have that got all this straightened out. But it was a huge difference. I mean, I am glad we did that before we even attempted VDI, because you look at us right now. We're doing a 16:9 HD video broadcast over the internet, and it's great because here at my house I've got fiber optic, gigabit internet. There's no stuttering, there's no stammering, everything's working great, but that's because the underlying foundation is there. Right. Same thing with the hospital. Once we got that foundation down, everything else fell into place.
Yep. Yeah, you pretty much got to have it. So let's talk about your virtual desktop story that happened there, and specifically around VDI. You got the network all shored up, and then you guys had to make a decision, right? There was really two players at that point in time, Citrix and VMware, on the VDI front, and I was there. I got to see you kind of go through that decision-making process, and it was the Citrix team and the infrastructure team having to agree upon what you were going to do going forward. So tell us how that unfolded, and we'll expand upon it once you get that story out, because I know it's kind of boiling up underneath here.
Yeah. Well, our big concern with VDI was we wanted control of that desktop. We had people who were installing WeatherBug and all kinds of other crazy stuff on their local PCs, and we had tried to lock them down. We had tried to, use various tools to make sure that those PCs weren't compromised, because again, this is medical information. This is critical stuff that has to be there for the patient and for their treatment. So the idea of having VDI where we had complete control of that session, nobody could install anything, and as soon as you badged out or logged off, it wiped that whatever they had done or attempted to do and reset it back to a clean build, if you will, was intriguing for us as an IT group. We said, this could be how we can control the desktop on the clinical side.
Non-persistent desktops delivered from the data center for clinical workstations, right?
And that's the key. Clinical.
Okay.
Clinical workstations. We did not attempt to push it out. Still don't have it in the business area or the finance area or anywhere else other than clinical. We have right now at the hospital 800 clinical workstations. And as you say, we got into a real discussion over which way to go. The final decision was rather interesting, and the reasoning was I was the only Citrix guy.
Right.
I'm the only one that knew that suite of products.
Right.
And we had myself and others that were VMware guys. And so we said, look, we're going to have a better shot at supporting VMware than we would Citrix. That's just the way the decision went at the time. I like what I've heard other folks say about the difference between VMware and Citrix VDI, and that is that if you just want to get something rolled out, you want it quick, simple, and work, great. Use VMware, no problem. If you want to tweak it, if you want to be able to manipulate it and have all the bells and whistles, then go with Citrix. So I kind of like that. I think that's the way it kind of came down for us.
Couple quick points there. One thing, which is probably more important than anything you just said technically, is you kept your use case simple to begin with. Right. And that's where a lot of people go wrong. They try to go from a little bit of Citrix app virtualization, or none even, to thinking they're going to virtualize the entire hospital. And that is where you come up into some real problems. But you kept your use case simple, and you used the technology that was very much simplified, that you knew was going to have limits in what it could do, but at the time was probably the right choice for a very simple, simplified use case. Now, I do have to point out,
support structure.
And support, absolutely.
And that's what I like to call is that put it where it makes sense. I mean, don't just put it out there because you have it. Put it where it makes sense first, like you did, and then as they see those cases working, you can see other places where it makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. We also had a lot of doctors that had gone to seminars, you know, just like we go to tech shows and so forth. They had seen Follow Me desktops. They'd seen the ability to badge and walk to another room and badge back in and have that same session. We were hearing they wanted that. We also wanted to provide this control of the desktop. So it was kind of a perfect storm. It came together. And then I think the next thing that helped us in our success is that we involved the user community. We got people together, doctors, nurses, clinicians, and said, what do you need out of a desktop? What applications must you have for a clinical desktop? I don't want to hear about I got to watch YouTube. What exactly do you need to do your job as a clinician? And they made up a list of applications. We had a very specific list of 24, I think it was, applications that were the clinical desktop, nothing else. Everything else was excluded. Then we allowed the doctors and nurses to set certain goals that we had in terms of when you badge in, how long will it be until you need to re-authenticate and actually use a password? And, of course, we wanted to tighten that down as much as possible. They argued, well, I'm treating patients. I can't be involved with constantly typing passwords. So we arranged, came to a consensus of about a 4-hour period. In an 8-hour day, work day, having a 4-hour period of you badge in the morning, you can work for 4 hours just badging in. But at the end of that 4-hour period, you had to re-authenticate, and then you could badge in the rest of the day. All of those decisions and all the timeouts and all the things that were involved, we allowed this community to decide that we had set up kind of an advisory panel of clinicians, so that by the time we delivered that, they were on board. It wasn't IT is throwing this at us and making us use something that we don't understand. They were really involved from the very get-go on how to develop this environment. And all of that is really a critical part of why it was successful.
That's a great thing to point out, and I definitely want to come back and underscore that the community, right, make it their idea, give them ownership in your project. I do have to point out one quick thing, you know, as a diehard Citrix guy, and I was around for all those conversations. I should point out very succinctly that when you guys chose the View product, that was before Citrix had the machine creation service as the image management piece. And so VMware had this little cloning technology that they had, which was very simplified and had some really bad things about it too. But these days, if you're looking for simplicity, you can get that out of Zen Desktop because you can just use MCS and not have to do PVS, which I know we can agree on this for sure. When you hand a provisioning server to a VMware server virtualization guy who's supposed to be your virtualization expert, and then they'd look at it, they don't understand it, right? So that was one of the complexity things that you were alluding to a while ago, is provisioning server was the image management piece, which still is and still really should be in a lot of cases, but machine creation service makes Citrix an easy choice too for straight up VDI, especially if you keep it simple and keep it easy.
Right. Keep it in a simple environment, and if you've got a small shop and you just want to have a VDI environment, that would be the way to go. Now, jumping ahead just a bit, at UNC Health Care, we're using provisioning services. We're using the full-blown product with all the bells and whistles, and it's Zen Desktop 7.6 that we're working on.
Let's transition that a little bit. Let's.
Okay.
So you were doing VDI at the hospital in a very simplified fashion, and in your opinion, maybe more importantly, the end user's opinion, big success, mediocre success?
It was huge. It was really huge because, again, our reputation as an IT group had been a little tarnished over the years. This was us involving ourselves in the user community and getting the clinicians, pulling them into the process. By the time we rolled it out, we had groups, because we rolled it out a group at a time. We had groups saying, "I want to be next." "No, I want to be next." Right. They were clamoring for it. Yeah. So by the time we really got it rolled out completely, people were just thrilled with it, and the idea that they could. Matter of fact, some of the issues we ran across was if you badge out of this room where you've been charting a patient, and you go into the next room and you badge in, and it's left right where you left off. The other patient from the other room was still up, and a nurse would forget and start charting in that patient's data. We caught that very quickly, and were able to set it so that when you badge out through Improvata, it would launch something that would close the application, just the application that they were doing the charting in, so that when they logged back in, they still had to launch that application, but they launched it based on that new patient that they were working with in that room. So that was a learning process to see the gotchas of that Follow Me desktop.
So the desktop was already up and ready for them. They just needed to bring the application up. So you've already
just that one charting application.
Still saved you saved them time.
Exactly. Yeah. But we forced them to keep in mind where they were and who they were charting on in that case, because nurses and doctors have a lot on their mind rather than the computing side. We wanted to try to make it as simple for them as a user to function in that environment without having to think technology. That's something that they're just not used to.
So let's recap that VDI experiment not experiment, but implementation at the hospital like this. Mm-hmm. You kept it simple, kept the use case simple. You involved the end users early so they had some sense of ownership, and you tackled it a group at a time instead of trying to just go do a big bang type implementation. So that's the VDI story. It sounds like it was a big success. I think a lot of people are just now even talking about doing VDI, and to be fair, potentially some of that could have been server-based desktops, right?
Exactly.
May or may not have had to have been VDI.
We discussed that.
Yep.
We discussed using Zen app published desktops. I was a little concerned about the performance, again, because of the experience we'd had with poor performance. So, I wanted to give us all the horsepower we needed, which is why we went with VDI, strict VDI.
Okay, so I have to ask this question, and we don't have to go too deep into it. We've got about 20 minutes left, and we haven't answered any questions yet. But for VDI, you had X number of concurrent users. How many users was it?
800.
800. And how many physical servers did it take to satisfy 800 concurrent VDI users?
24.
24 physical, and that was 800 concurrent users? Okay, and what was the total number of users that were using the environment?
Well, that's really, there's around 1,000 users, but there's 800 concurrent sessions.
Okay, so 800%, 24 servers. Just real quick, give us the specs on those servers.
They are 6-core, dual processor, 6-core, roughly 2.5 gigahertz processors.
Okay.
And I think it's 128 gig of memory. Actually, I think we bumped it up a little bit after that, but we started out with 128 gig per host.
Okay.
And this is on VMware, by the way.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So that was the 24 physical servers. How many virtual servers were running on those physical servers?
Let's see. Well, the 800 desktops, obviously, but we also had the entire infrastructure.
Infrastructure for so you still had applications being virtualized too, as well.
We had 56 servers in the Zen app environment, which included, EdgeSite. It included our database server for Citrix. It included the 2 data collectors, all of the different servers, including the application servers that were still serving, this is a key point too, still serving XenApp published applications because the applications were still coming through XenApp, whereas the desktop was being presented by VMware View at that time. And the reason we did that is we found the more we built into the VDI desktop, installed it locally in that image, the slower the boot times were. And we were kind of being judged on our boot times by the doctors. And so the tighter we could keep that image, the thinner, the smaller it was, we were able to finally achieve 8-second boot times from badging in, boom, bringing it up, and being in their session, working in their session was 8 to 10 seconds easily. And there was a point that we had it at about 1.5 minutes with everything installed. So we backed off of that, slimmed it down, and just delivered the applications through XenApp.
Yeah, and by that, Bill, you really meant login time, right? How long it took for the doctor to
go
login
from, specifically.
Right, not necessarily the boot time. But okay, so I'll sum that up with saying Citrix XenApp saved VMware View's project, right? Is that fair? Okay.
Pretty much, exactly, yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure we'll see that on VMware's page.
Yeah.
Well, so I'll sum that up by saying at some point, Windows desktops and the user experience is all about the application. So while we're getting ready to turn this conversation, or we have turned it towards virtual desktops, it's that old story you have from the Center of Excellence. It's still the main story. It just gets migrated into a desktop at some point, maybe or maybe not. But application virtualization is still where it's at. That's still the
That's the bread and butter.
It
really is. And the fact that XenApp makes it so easy to publish those applications, particularly very diverse, very odd applications. We still have a version 5 XenApp farm running on Windows 2003 because some of our applications refuse to run under a 64-bit 2008, 2012 environment. So those older, what I call dumber applications that have to run on an XP type, base, we still have in our 5.0 farm. So we have the 5.0 farm, we have 6.5 farm, and in my case, in High Point, there's no drive to go to 7.6 in High Point because everything's going to come out of UNC and Metamont, our data center up there. So we're kind of pulling everything apart in High Point and building up this new environment up at UNC in Chapel Hill.
So UNC Health Care has, I don't know, 10 or 16, I can't remember the exact number of hospitals at this point, and those hospitals are all going to be serviced through virtual desktops coming from the UNC Health Care data centers using Citrix Zen Desktop, and there will be some aspect of XenApp as well, server-hosted shared apps also being delivered either to those virtual desktops or straight to endpoint devices. You want to take just a minute or two and just tell us what you're doing there, and then we'll jump in and try to answer some of these questions?
All right, sure. As we moved toward, High Point were brought into the UNC Healthcare system, I had to start transitioning from, my title there was a server engineer, to systems architect, which is my new title up at UNC Healthcare. And the idea there is to architect solutions from a technical point of view. VDI, we'd already decided, based on some successes like High Point, was going to be a good delivery system, particularly with single sign-on, badging in, Imprivata, and so forth. So we were moving in that direction because we are a huge Citrix shop, and by that I mean UNC Healthcare. We had tons of licenses available. They'd all been converted to Zen Desktop licenses, even though you could use them for XenApp. So that was a factor. But then also the new Zen Desktop 7.6 environment with provisioning services, we saw as a real advantage to scaling this because scaling to all these hospitals was going to be a key factor for us. And what we came up with, and I've got a couple of slides if you want to switch to them.
Absolutely. Yep, I'll get it over to you.
All right. Let me see if I can pull up the slideshow here.
So Bill, UNC Healthcare is moving forward with VDI using Zen Desktop, and I know one of the reasons for that flat out is the fact that your EMR, I think in this case Epic, I think they're telling you that's all they're going to support really in terms of virtual desktops, right? I mean, they'll do server apps like XenApp type stuff, but when it comes to a desktop, they're actually telling you guys that it needs to be VDI. And is that accurate?
Somewhat. They support both VMware View and Zen Desktop, and as a matter of fact, we had to kind of get a little bit of special permission to use 7.6 because they had only tested Zen Desktop under what 6.5, I guess.
5.6.
So 5.6. So you know, we had to kind of work with them on that, and they have done some accommodation for us because of the size of our system. So that was a key point. But can you see the slides now? Does everybody see them?
Yeah, we can see them. Yep.
All right. What we decided is to use a pod approach, being able to design an environment that we could deploy in pods in phases. So let me jump to the next slide here. If I can get my, there we go. So here's what we're doing. Phase 1 will be a pod, which will give us 4,166 concurrent desktops. So 2 vCenter servers, 34 ESX60 hosts, this is vSphere 6, and that'll give us 4,100 concurrent desktops in phase 1.
Bill, can I ask you a question? Because this
Sure.
came up when you were talking about your other VDI. In your current High Point Regional VDI and this VDI, give us an example of what the virtual machine footprint looks like. How many virtual processors, how much virtual memory, and how much disk space for each VDI desktop?
For each VDI desktop, we're using, it's about 10 gig because we've pared it down as much as we can, about 10 gig per desktop. That's on a data store of the NetApp solid state drives. So it's all solid state.
By 10 gig, you're talking about the virtual hard drive space?
The virtual hard drive space, right. Mm-hmm.
And you're using provisioning servers, so in that case, you're talking about just the write cache location area, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay, and so what about the virtual processor and virtual memory for each of those VDI instances?
Basically, we're looking at, again, the blades or the UCS blades that they're in use are going to be 12 core, dual core, but 12 processor cores in it, and then they are running about 3 gigahertz and 256 gig of memory.
And you have one quick techie question: is hyperthreading on or off?
Excuse me?
Is hyperthreading turned on or off?
It's turned on.
Turned on. Okay.
Yep.
And maybe I just missed this, but each individual VM has how much virtual processor and how much virtual memory?
Right. There we're running about 2 gig of memory. This is Windows 7 64-bit desktops. We're running 2, and there was some argument about maybe going to 4, and we may end up at 4 gig per desktop. And then you know, we're running. The other thing that we're doing, and this isn't on this set of slides, but I've got a separate slide for the NVIDIA K1 card that we're installing in the UCS M4 chassis. We had to get that chassis so we could put this card that gives us the video capability. And really, that was a discussion we ended up having with you that kind of drove the need for that video card. I think we're really going to be glad we did that.
You're putting base graphics cards and virtualizing those into each VDI session, so that each VDI desktop at least gets a little bit of graphics card help.
Right. We're using the K1 rather than the K2 for cost reasons, but still in all, it's going to give us a real benefit if they want to do any 3D graphing within those VDI sessions. And we're hearing now of some applications that are probably going to require it. So I'm really glad we added that in.
Well, and so that's really key what you just said. You just said before, just a minute ago, you were talking about liking or being having the graphics cards virtual in this case available to the VDI was nice to have, and then you said, oh, and we have some applications that require some type of graphics card to be in there.
Exactly.
That's really why, you know, you and I and your team had a conversation around getting graphics cards in those virtual desktops, because, you may have applications down the road that just flat out require them, and it's not a nice to have, it's a requirement to get those apps to even install and run.
Right, and it would have been very painful to have to go back and re-architect that rather than doing it up front and have this capability right from the start.
Yeah, and just somebody just asked this question again, last one I saw, but you answered it. I think currently you guys are putting 2 gigs of virtual memory per VM, and I'm assuming you don't have dynamic memory turned on, right? This is static memory. But you said there's a chance you might end up going to 4,
right.
And you guys are kind of teetering on that idea right now. And
well, the difference is in VMware View and HighPoint, those are 32-bit Windows 7 desktops, and so they can only see 3 gig, and those are set to use 2 gig for those desktops. With these, since they're 64-bit, we could go higher than that 3 gig, and so we may go ahead and go to 4.
Yeah, okay. Well, hey, that sounds...
Processors per desktop or single processor per desktop? I don't remember where you said that.
That's a very good question, because there are reasons to use a single processor, and we argued back and forth on that. But there's also some applications that can use dual processors and as you mentioned earlier, the hyper-threading for the application. So that was a big point of discussion, because the simpler you can keep your architecture in terms of single processor and so forth, VMware overall is happier because it has to do less emulation, through software. However, there's also good reasons to use dual processor, or even in some cases, some servers, quad-core processors for your guests. So you can get into some real religious arguments on that.
Okay.
But anyway, getting back to the slide here, as you can see, Pod 1, 4100, and I'm going to round here. Phase 2 would be 8300, and then Phase 3, 12,500, which is our current goal in the near term, to have 12,500 concurrent desktops running. At that point, as you can see, 34 ESX6 hosts to accomplish that, and we have already purchased the hardware for this. So it's, and I believe...
Bill, are we still talking about clinical desktops at this point, or are we moved on to clinical and staff and other use cases?
No, we're still just talking clinical desktops, because we have 22,000 employees, both of all sorts, doctors, nurses, and IT and everything else. So 22,000 of that 12,000 clinical desktops across all of our hospitals and locations is a reasonable start.
And those are all volatile, non-persistent desktops, all 12,500.
Right, exactly. Yep. And as you can see from this slide, we've got Metamont Data Center, and then we've got what we call the Cancer Center, 2 data centers, and we're trying to make it redundant across those 2, so that if one data center completely failed, we could handle the load over on the other data center. So we're speccing it to be able to handle that kind of failover if necessary.
Hey, Bill, is that going to be an active data center and a passive data center, or 2 active data centers?
Unfortunately, we don't have, because of NetApp's limitations, we don't have the equivalent of, say, a EMC VMX type active environment. But what we've been able to do is script this in such a way that the failover is very quick. Within 15 minutes, we can fail over. So it isn't active in that sense. We have to actually initiate it.
So it's active, passive, but it's
right.
15 minutes is the goal. Okay. Hey, so look, this is great. This is great information. I hope people are enjoying this. I hope people are getting both business and technical things out of it. Anything else you want to share about the UNC Health Care implementation your team is working on? I want to come back to that in a minute.
Well, that's a key point. It is a team. I mean, I definitely want people to understand this is not the Bill Bailey show at all. As a matter of fact, our team of architects has developed this, and while I'm still down here in High Point. So a lot of this, I'm not as closely involved in the actual development of every piece of it. But we're looking at a lot of different products to help us with profiling, to help us with printing, to help us with a lot of the different issues that come up, particularly with an environment of this size. We haven't necessarily settled on all of those various applications and vendors and so forth. So, and I'm not here to name any of those names anyway, but it is an issue to look at how do we deliver printing? How does a printer follow a doctor or a nurse as they move through the hospital? Because you don't want it to print out on the 3rd floor when they're now on the 8th floor. Those kinds of things. So those are issues that have to be of concern to you as you move from terminal to terminal. Yeah. And something else real quickly we ran into is how do we repurpose old desktops into terminals for this new environment? And so we started looking at software that would allow us to do that, and not only do it, but manage it and manage those terminals, newly created terminals from that hardware. So there's a lot to think about. This is a big endeavor.
Absolutely, huge. Well, I mean, I'm glad you said that, because, right, it took us 30 years to go from the PC that got evolved or developed, and maybe 40 at this point, from the PC to where the PC is at today. I hear people talking about virtual desktops like it's going to be a 3-month project. It took us 30 years to get to where we are today with the PC, moving that back to a hosted virtualized PC that's now presented to the endpoint. That's not a 6-month project. That's maybe years in the making, but the reality is we kind of have to get there. So because somebody asked that question, quantify for me, if you will, the number of people on your team at UNC Health Care, which is a really large healthcare organization with a big IT, and the number of people at High Point when you were running the Citrix environment there. At High Point, how many of you guys ran Citrix, the virtual desktop and virtual app environment?
Right. We had a core team of 4 people.
4 people at High Point?
4 people in High Point.
Okay.
That included me on the VMware side, the back end, if you will. Then we had another person who was more he was from the desktop environment, as a matter of fact. He worked with developing the desktop, all the experiments involving speeding up that boot time or start time, all of that. And then we had somebody that was kind of a project manager type position. And then ultimately, we also had another desktop guy that helped us with the view management outside of VMware, in other words, just specifically view. So I did the VMware side, he did the view side. We basically had a good team of these 4 guys. Over time now, we've lost 2 of those guys. They've moved to other companies. So me and Mario are left handling view. And between the 2 of us, we are able to handle it. I've picked up a few things in his world, and he's picked up a lot of things in my world. Matter of fact, he'd probably do it all on his own at this point.
Do those 4 people, does that also include the app virtualization coming out of XenApp for that VDI environment? Or
that was all done through XenApp that we already had, and I was handling that myself. So
those 4 people continued to do virtual desktops and virtual apps. Okay, so that's right. The High Point side. What does the UNC Health Care team look like to support ultimately, eventually 25,000 users? What do you expect that team, how big do you expect that Citrix team to be, or virtual desktop app team to be?
Our Citrix team up there is primarily 2 server architects, and then we have engineers, because the way we're set up there, we have server architects or systems architects, then we have engineers, and then we have desktop and end user services, and which also includes operations and help desk, I believe. I'm still getting used to all the different nuances of this, but I specifically work a lot with the architects and the engineers. Now, in terms of the number, we have about 10 architects, we have about 15 engineers, and then end user services and operations probably would get into the hundreds, because it is such a large environment, and everybody is going to have some part to play in this. I just got out of a meeting before I drove back down here to High Point from Easttown, which is where we're located up there at Chapel Hill, and we had a meeting with engineers and architects meeting together about the VDI project. So it's been a very collaborative effort.
Yeah. Well, so we're pretty much out of time on the 1 hour span, and if you're okay with hanging out for another couple minutes and be honest on that, let me know. We'll keep you on, and we'll answer some of these questions. You have a lot of great content, right? I hate that we've run over. We always do, right? But at the same time, I think you've answered a lot of these questions through the dialogue. so I didn't want to stop you and go into all that right then. But so let's knock out a few of these. The very first question that came in was data, right? And I tell people all the time, it's all about apps, it's all about apps. And every once in a while, somebody will call me out and say, well, what about the data?
Right.
Your data at High Point and your data at UNC, and we don't have to go into a lot of detail. Was it all in the data center? You weren't connecting to third-party clouds and
No.
that kind of stuff, not yet.
It's all in the data center because of HIPAA regulations. We have to be very, very careful of where that data for those patients are.
Yeah.
So
you're kind of easy. You don't really have to decide because HIPAA's saying you got to keep it in the data center anyway. But there are lots of people that are starting to try to figure out, okay, if I'm going to virtualize my desktop over here, what happens when it needs to get to share file or Dropbox or Azure or OneDrive or my personal thumb drive, all that good stuff. So certainly within the realm of what you can do within Citrix, but it's certainly an evolving story right now as to how we integrate with all that stuff.
Right, and the security side is a big issue.
So we talked a little while ago about the network challenges you found, and you kind of went through the topology at High Point Regional being needing to be evolved, which went a long way towards your virtual apps and virtual desktop story. Somebody asked, so at High Point, what are you guys using for endpoints? For that VDI implementation?
That's a very good question because it has, after all these years, this is about 3 years into the project, it's now going to end up biting us. And here's the reason. We decided to go with zero clients, rather than thin clients. And I know zero clients is something you don't want to hear about because you've got your own way of looking at it. And I agree with you. After you gave me the presentation you did about zero clients, I now see the wisdom in thin clients. But because of that, our clients are WISE terminals that are strictly VMware View, nothing else in it. They're Teradici that works with Imprivata. It's built into the firmware, and they are single-threaded. There's nothing you can do with them other than View. Well, now we're going to Zen Desktop. So all of those terminals are going to have to be pulled out as well as the badge readers because the badges for UNC is on a different frequency than our High Point badges. So we've got to pull out the readers, we've got to pull out the terminals, and we've got to put in all new equipment because of moving to Zen Desktop. Now, had we stuck with a thin client that had the capability to do both protocols, we wouldn't have had that issue.
So basically zero in your case, and this is for everybody I think, is zero limits you to zero options if you make a change.
That is
right?
very true.
So zero sounds great, but and you said thin clients. Thin clients can be Windows, they can be Linux,
right.
They can be stripped down Linux, which would be a zero client. It's just good to know that zero clients can be very they can handcuff you if you're not careful. So anyway,
they're sexy. Don't get me wrong. It's very cool, but you end up paying for that cool down the road.
Potentially, for sure. Either that or you get locked into a vendor that you can't get out of.
Right.
Okay, and then you said something about UNC. You actually talked about repurposing PCs, right? Is that the common criteria at UNC Hospital? Is if there's not a thin client there that can be reused to reuse the Windows?
Well, as you can imagine, with a hospital system, a healthcare system as large as we are, there's lots of hardware out there, and a lot of that hardware is reasonable hardware. I mean, it's kept up to date pretty well. So the ability to take that hardware and repurpose it as a thin client for VDI and dedicate it to that is really attractive to us. And it keeps us from having to buy a ton of terminals, although we are, basically what we're doing is saying this: if it exists now as a desktop or a laptop or some kind of device, computer on wheels, we'll convert it. But if it needs to be replaced, if it ages out, we'll replace it with a terminal. Yeah.
So I'm sure there's a ton of folks that would like to have more information on how you plan to convert those, but maybe that's a different story for a different day. One of the things that we talked about earlier was server-based desktops versus maybe VDI-based desktops, and one of the things that was commented about early on in this conversation was bad applications, right? Windows applications, not necessarily Microsoft Windows applications, but applications written to run on top of Windows for a bunch of years, and still today were very poorly written, and they would have a lot of memory leaks and issues going on. Right. And the only way to tackle that was to reboot the machine every so often. But one of the nice things about VDI, right, if it's a non-persistent, every time the user logs off, you reboot the machine back to a gold image, and all those poorly written apps kind of fix themselves or get fixed. They don't fix themselves; they get fixed by the reboot. That had to be a very big pro for you guys in your VDI, and maybe part of the reason why you're pursuing VDI again this time.
Absolutely, and that And even from a virus perspective, if you get a zero-day virus attack, it hits a desktop, the ability to just get out of that desktop and have it drop back and no longer be infected because you're back to an image that was not infected, it's all held in memory, means that even from that point of view, there's a benefit in having a non-persistent desktop. But definitely, you were talking about server-based XenApp published desktops, as I like to call them. That's at one computer, and you may have 30 people with desktops coming off of that computer. If something happens to its memory and it crashes or has to be rebooted, you've affected 30 users. Whereas with a VDI session, that single user can re-image basically from a gold image that session, and they're back and working. They have their own world that they haven't impacted anybody else. So that was attractive to us as well. That was part of our discussion.
Yeah, I call that picking your poison, right? There's pros and cons for each. So you did mention this earlier. I don't know if this person's dropped off or not, but you mentioned third-party, what I call user persona management. A lot of people call profile management, and I think if you call it profile management, you're cutting yourself real short.
True.
Persona management, where you're managing the user settings. At High Point, doesn't sound like you guys had to go to a third party for that. No. At UNC, it sounds like you guys are at least contemplating that. Can you expand on that?
Right. In High Point, we used the persona management that is built into View, which is very, very rudimentary, very simple. But again, we were, by choice, trying to keep our desktops extremely simple and very easy to manage. So that worked out well. Plus, it was less costly in the long run to do it that way. We had a lot of experience within different parts of the healthcare system, specifically with Rex Healthcare in Raleigh, with AppSense. And they decided, hey, let's look at the advantages that AppSense gives us for the VDI desktop. And so they started looking into that, and that's why they settled on using that for that kind of control of the profile.
Okay. So questions around storefronts, and so I think we talked about this, but to be really clear and kind of make sure we're clear on this conversation, at UNC, so at High Point, you guys had VDI virtual desktops that would get their applications from another hosted solution, in this case Citrix XenApp.
Right.
I would say, did you guys consider just delivering the app straight to the endpoint? But I know the answer to that, because you guys did that in the beginning, right? That's how you got to VDI. You would deliver the app straight from web interface at that point. At this point in time, storefront.
Right.
But you guys at some point made the decision to go away from endpoints accessing the apps directly to endpoints accessing a desktop that would then access the apps. What was the main reason why you went around? You went kind of around to get to the virtual desktop to get to the apps, and not just continue to deliver the apps to the endpoint?
Well, the big thing, like I said earlier, was just control. The endpoint in the previous scenario was a computer that people could install things on. Now, we could have locked it down and used deep freeze and a bunch of other technologies to make sure that didn't happen, but that's not the way we were working at the time. So over time, those desktops would just get piled on by all kinds of garbage and malware and so forth, and it would end up affecting really patient care. So that's why we went to the VDI scenario, where we could lock it down really solid. Once they badged out, that desktop was no longer persistent. So that was the reason for going that route.
Okay. I mean, a desktop is just a better workspace for users, right? And having more control of that workspace probably goes a long way, even if it means you got to double hop to get to the application.
Right.
So John asked, and I think you addressed this to a large degree. You addressed this. How did you get your login times down in your VDI solution? And I think basically you said we just ripped out as many apps as we could. Is that
right. We pared it down as best we could. Now there are tools. Microsoft specifically has some tools that will strip out everything that you can from that instance. For instance, negotiating for Wi-Fi is not an issue in this case. You pull that out. There's all kinds of stuff that runs in the background that we disable and we pull out. And locally installed apps. I mean, obviously there's no games installed. Everything is pared down as much as possible to get that desktop as thin as it can be, and that will help with boot times. as well as there's a lot of optimization that can be done on startup. For instance, like I mentioned, we used Imprivata, which gave us some scripting capability to do startup and mapping of drives in the background, drive shares, and so forth. So a lot of tools that make things happen a little bit quicker, get it back up.
So another question we have here is about storage. So your VDI solution that you had at High Point, you guys had that all hooked up to a SAN. Is that fair, fiber attached SAN?
Right. We initially started out with an EMC SAN because we were in an EMC shop. When we connected with UNC Health Care and were acquired by them, their standard is NetApp. So when our EMC SAN aged out, we moved to NetApp and are running all NetApp equipment.
So the new VDI solution today is going in on top of NetApp.
Right.
I have a quick question for you that I just thought of. Are you attaching that fiber, or is it iSCSI, or is it NFS?
It is NFS.
NFS.
Right.
10 gig?
Yeah.
10 gig Ethernet NFS?
Right. As a matter of fact, between our two data centers, we have two 10 gig pipes between them.
And is that on a dedicated private network that's happening on, or is that just part of the same network?
For the storage, no, that is dedicated.
Dedicated private network. Okay, great.
Yep.
Let's see, from a clinical perspective, were you first in, sorry, I read that wrong. I think you've addressed a lot of these. To the graphics part, really talking graphics in your VDI desktop, VDI backend at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at UNC, are you guys going to be delivering apps through XenApp to those VDI desktops?
For the most part, yeah.
But then you're going to have
there will be some things that will be local, like Dragon, for instance.
Okay, so some things baked into VDI.
Right.
And then some things that will actually be presented to the VDI desktop.
Right. So like Epic Hyperspace is baked in. Dragon is baked in. There's something called Synapse that we were talking about today that's going to involve the some graphics application within that. I'm not familiar with that, so I can't say a whole lot about it. But all of that is going to be baked in. But then the basic applications that we have been using through the years, those will still come off XenApp.
Okay. And as of right now, that won't have graphics acceleration on the XenApp piece, or will it?
No, not on XenApp.
Okay.
We haven't needed it up to this point, for those applications. But these newer applications, we do.
Are you guys going to tackle any of the really intensive graphical applications at this point that might require you to move to a K2 card for some use cases, or is that next or out of scope for right now?
It's out of scope for right now, but, it's like I told the group this morning when we were talking, scope creep is inevitable. Somebody somewhere is going to say, hey, let's put this on VDI, and that way we can have it, all the hospitals will have access and so forth. Okay, great. But if that's the case, we're going to have to maybe go to K2s or something else or whatever technology is out at that time.
So Chris asked a really good question, and I should have thought of it back when you mentioned it. In the clinical rollout of VDI that you had, obviously within clinical you've got lots of little departments within clinical. Mm-hmm. Can you just walk us through the first 3 or 4 that you tackled and the order you tackled them? How did you pick the clinical you were going to tackle?
We actually did that by a process where we asked what application they needed, we looked at the application, and we went with the simplest first by decision. So we said, okay, we're gonna wean our way into this, and we saved the ER for last because they had the oldest, grungiest, stupidest application in the world, still is, and it will only run on XenApp 5 in Windows 2003 because it's just such a bad application. So they were the last on the list because their app was so bad. Yeah. And we knew it would be a problem. We tried thin-apping it. We tried all kinds of virtualization. Nothing really worked for that application. The only thing that would work is XenApp 5, and so that's why we had to stick with that.
And so you guys have made a conscious decision to stay on XenApp 5 for
that app.
Just for that app, and do you have no roadmap to get off that app at any time?
It will die a serious death when we go to Epic, which I'm ecstatic about. That will get rid of that app. It will also get rid of the version 5 farm, and even our 6.5 farm in High Point will eventually dwindle down because from the 65 applications at its height, it will shrink down to only 2 remaining in High Point, and then those will finally go away after probably about 18 months, and we'll be entirely on these in-app farm up at Easttown. So I'm tearing down my kingdom.
Yeah, in a good way, right?
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
So Brad brought up a little while ago that you guys are using VMware ESX as the underlying hypervisor at UNC Health Care, and you've got graphics virtualization in place. So obviously you guys must be on at least version 6, right? So that you get graphics virtualization involved. I just want to make sure I said that for everybody. Are you using have you guys looked at using any of the performance enhancing tools that you install in addition to Citrix in these environments to try to tweak the application performances, to keep applications from, overrunning the memory stack or over consuming the processor? Have you guys looked at any of those technologies in your career within Citrix? Have you used any of those, and are you looking at those now?
Well, specifically there was a module in AppSense that allowed us that kind of control, and that's why we initially were looking at AppSense. And that the way they sell AppSense, they sell it in different modules. And so we got the module for the performance control, but then we said, okay, we can also use it for this, and we got another module. Well, we can also use it for this. We got another module. So we're going to end up with a full AppSense suite before it's over with.
Yeah. So Chris asked about Epic and whether you were doing that in server-hosted shared apps and desktops or VDI, and I know your answer to that, right? You guys are going to do Epic at UNC Health Care in a VDI desktop. And that's where they support it, right? Which is a little weird, right? Because Epic's been in server-hosted apps for years, but when you start talking about moving it to a desktop, all of a sudden it's, well, you need to do that in VDI, which, I don't know, sounds kind of weird for me, but that's kind of the case, right?
Well, I think they're looking at the fact that you have a dedicated processor, memory, and so forth for that application per desktop as opposed to shared. And maybe they think their application will work a little more smoothly in that environment. I don't know all their reasoning, but one thing about Epic, they are very controlling when it comes to their application. They tell you what you can and can't do and still remain supported.
Well, and ultimately, and that's what I tell people all the time, is when you're moving out, you're doing these projects, you have to get with your application vendors and ask them, what do they support, what are they willing to let you do, and if they say, no, you can't do it that way, then you got to make a decision as an organization, okay, I get it, you're not going to support it that way, but I'm going to do it that way. Or, like you guys are saying, okay, that's too important, we're not going to go around them and do it the way we think we can do it, we're going to do it exactly the way they say we have to, right?
Right, exactly.
So, Ian,
it's a risk you're willing to accept. You could do it your way, but you need to be able to make it happen, whatever the problem is, in an environment they do support.
Yeah, sounds like one of those potentially career-limiting moves if you're not
exactly.
So I asked you a while ago about oversubscribing memory or doing dynamic memory. Ian asked also around CPU. Are you guys oversubscribing the CPUs and letting the hypervisor do its thing, or are you trying to stay within the limits of what the calculations would come up without oversubscribing the CPUs?
We're trying to stay within the limits. As a matter of fact, we're scaling it in such a way that we're trying to be very conservative when it comes to those resources. I'd rather not stretch it and run into issues, particularly with something as visible as this. VDI for UNC Health Care is a huge and major project. It's going to impact workflows throughout the entire healthcare system in many hospitals. So we're trying to be very conservative on how we're doing it.
Yeah. So we're 20 minutes over. If people have to drop, that's completely okay. I did want to mention something. I don't know if George said it earlier. I don't know if I said it earlier. But we are going to start a thread out on the CUGC forum about the webinar, and any additional questions that you want to ask after this, we'll post them there and we'll try to answer them. Other people in the organization would probably like to answer them. Robert has a question around third-party monitoring at High Point and maybe now at UNC. Are you guys adding any third-party monitoring outside of just what's baked into the Citrix Zen Desktop Platinum stack?
We are using vRealize overall, which used to be vCops, for VMware to watch the entire environment. For Citrix, we've been using EdgeSight, which you heard me mention earlier, and then we're also going to be implementing the new Citrix Director, which will give us some capabilities as well to monitor things within Citrix. So the nice thing about being a premier client is that we have all these tools that we can use, and Citrix has been very good about working with us to flesh out this environment. We're kind of cutting edge on everything they're doing.
Right. Okay. Have you run into any issues repurposing any of those PCs that you're? I mean, what challenges have you guys found in repurposing the machine?
Well, it's a good question. There have been a lot of different. Well, let me back up a couple of steps. One of the things that we want a repurposed machine to do is act just like a terminal, in the sense of we don't want the user to have to come up, log into the PC, launch an application that brings up a screen that gets them into the VDI environment. We want them to come in, turn it on, badge in, and it act just like a regular terminal. So we're having to do some auto login behind the scenes. We're having to set things up behind the scenes, work with the printer, the local printer, make sure that the name is properly passed on to Citrix so that the name of that PC, which is part of what we're going to be using to map printers and resources, is carried over in that terminal session. So we've looked at a lot of tools to do that. Dell makes a tool. IGL makes a tool. There's even some open source tools out there like ThinStation. So we don't want to use that in a production, healthcare environment, obviously. But for those that want to experiment with it, I encourage you to check it out. But some of these other third-party applications we are looking at that are very useful in the tools they give you to do some of the kind of things that we're needing to do for these repurposed workstations.
Yeah. So I promise, somebody asked this question, I'm not bringing it back up, but I like it. So somebody said they missed the reason why you guys are going from View to Zen Desktop, and if I could paraphrase for you and tell me if I get this wrong, your use case was so simple at High Point that a simple solution like View was good enough, where at UNC it's just way too complex, and you need a more powerful, more robust, flexible tool, and also to throw in that piece that Citrix has also done some things to simplify Zen Desktop at the same time. But is that a fair way to answer that question?
Yeah, that's pretty good. The big thing is at High Point, the only Citrix support presence was me. Everybody else did something within VMware. So there was a familiarity with VMware products and product suite at High Point, whereas up at Chapel Hill with UNC, they're more of a Citrix shop. They had a broader support group that handled Citrix, a lot more familiarity with the Citrix product suite, although they did use VMware, still do, and all of this infrastructure is going to be built on top of VMware, but it just was a better fit to go with Zen Desktop, and as a team, we decided between View and Zen Desktop up there the same way that we did in High Point with what we had to work with there.
So I'm glad somebody asked this question, because I wasn't 100% clear on it either, because Bob asked about the the CPUs per VM, and I think you more answered the physical number of cores and number of sockets. At UNC, how many virtual processors will you guys be giving from day one to each VDI desktop? Is it 1 or 2 or 4?
It will be probably 2.
Okay.
I argued for 1, but we do have some applications that can use 2. And my thing was, if you aren't using both cores, if you're not using both CPUs, why use it? Make it simpler for VMware. Being a VMware guy, that was kind of my way of looking at it. Plus, we're not talking about, these desktops are not going to be running AutoCAD. They're going to be running things that's just going to display some data on a screen, mostly database applications that are really not that heavy. They're not going to require that much CPU. But the case was made for dual core. And fine, I gave in to that one.
Right. So Mark asked a question, and I think we've talked about it slightly, but just to make sure we got it covered, High Point Regional and now UNC, you guys are doing clinical, non-persistent, virtual VDI desktops for now. How long will it be before you guys start tackling more persistent desktops and more knowledge worker type desktops? Right.
Well, let me put it this way. The only persistent desktops we have are administrative desktops, and that's just for the architect group right now. The advantage for us is to have all of our tools installed in our individual sessions so that no matter where I am, I could bring up, matter of fact, even if I have a Chromebook, I could use Citrix Receiver for Chrome. I could bring up my VDI session through Zen Desktop, and I have all of my tools and windows available through my Chromebook. And I like my Chromebook. I use it for a lot of things. So that's a real key tool for me. Very light, very easy to carry around, inexpensive, yet I can get everything I need to support the environment for the administrative desktops. So right now, that's persistent is only for administrators.
So basically, I just heard you say the Citrix administrators are going to get the persistent desktops for now,
right?
But eventually there'll be other use cases where it might make sense, to give it to other
As the
people
use cases come up, we're willing to entertain them. Don't get me wrong. But for right now, we're really wanting that non-persistent desktop. That's one of the key drivers for us.
There was a question here. Has this been recorded? Yes, I believe this has been recorded, so I'm sure Brad will be working to get this out there. I think, Bill, that's it. I think the other questions that are on here we've tackled in some of the other questions that we've already answered, but either myself or Brad or George, somebody will start a thread out on the user group forums, and we can answer some more questions there as they come up. I think this has been really valuable. Bob, I've kind of commandeered just trying to get us through this, but any things you want to ask or bring up at this point?
No, actually, Andy, you've asked the great questions, really, and so I'm perfectly satisfied. It's been a great conversation for everybody, I think.
Okay, yeah, I really appreciate it. And again, we'll start this up. And Bill, as always, man, thanks for sharing. And I know you're a very valuable resource. I know there's other healthcare. I know there's other organizations, not even inside healthcare, that could benefit a lot from just your experience and your knowledge. It's amazing how I see a lot of people who are just getting started on this, what I call end-user compute journey, and there's other people that have been doing it for 20 years and doing it this way for 20 years. And I appreciate you sharing your information. Anything else you want to make sure you get out before you, and I guarantee if you're like me, 5 minutes from now, you're going to, oh man, I wish I'd have said that. But is there anything
that's probably true.
Is there anything else
I guess the big thing, again, I don't want to look like a one-man show. We've got a lot of great folks there at UNC that are doing tremendous jobs. Scott Burkhart, James Cole, Philip Spacek, a lot of guys. I'm not even naming everybody because there's such a large team. But believe me, those folks know what they're doing, and it's great to work with a strong team like that. And even in High Point, with the 4 guys that we had, we were a core team. We went to training together. We built the environment together. Having that team dynamic is really important to me. I love team effort and energy, because the more eyes you get on something, the more you're not potentially not going to miss a problem that you might encounter.
Well, I'm extremely happy you said it that way, because that's what this is. That's what this user share is about. It's about trying to create some type of team out there, right? We can go to any technical conference we want to, and there'll be a team of Microsoft people and VMware team people, and we're kind of sitting around as the Citrix guy, or a couple of us together. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us to kind of stand up and be a team together and share some of this information and really just kind of get ourselves organized around the CUGC as well as these webinars. Just huge opportunity to share and try to keep each other from having to struggle, right, with what's going on. Yep.
And if you don't mind a quick plug, you know that I do some videos. If you'd like to go to YouTube to DRBILLBAILEY, so it's youtube.com/Dr. Bill Bailey. I've got videos out there on virtualization, cloud computing, handheld devices, Chrome, all kinds of different technologies, and a show that I call the Dr. Bill Show that's just fun, silly, interesting things. So check it out. Those of you that like it, don't give me any thumbs down. Give me some thumbs up on YouTube.
Hey, well, I really appreciate it, guys. We're down to 105 people, but man, 105 people on the very first one, and an hour and a half into it is fantastic. And so that means we must have done something right here, and we'll continue to grow this. And if somebody out there wants to be our guest next time, let us know. I've got a couple people I'm already thinking about that would probably be really good fits, and I really appreciate you jumping on and sharing this information, guys. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that was another thing I wanted to throw in there too. Was that this is for everybody. This is for the whole community, the people that are on here, and the people that will be checking this out later. And if you've got some great ideas, we would love to hear them. There's no stop to what we could do with this in a presentation, and then moving on again with our meetups.
Yeah, everybody has their own story, and they become experts of their own environment.
Yeah,
got it.
Well, Bob, I'm glad you actually said the meetup part, right? If your local area group is not meeting, do something to get somebody involved, and let me know, and I'll try to, or George know, and we'll try to do what we can to get a meeting going on in your area. We want to do this online once a month, but we want you guys meeting with each other face to face once a quarter at least. That would be awesome.
Sure. Yep.
All right, guys, I appreciate it, and I hope everybody has a good rest of your day. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Thanks,
All
Bill.
right.
Appreciate it. Great stuff.